So my name is Brian Dolliner, and I work for the Public Eye newspaper. I write articles about the criminal justice system in Champaign County. I also finished a PhD in 2005. I learned how to write. I like to write, so I'm not a trained journalist, I should let you know, but I think I do have the critical faculties to understand what's going on in Champaign County. Well, in many ways, it's typical for what's going on across the country. You could find it going on in just about any city, big city, small city across the country. That the courts have become these heavy-handed mechanisms for doling out what they believe is justice, but it's led to these bloated prison system that we have. If you walk over the court system any day, you'll find largely people of color, largely African Americans, poor folks, okay, who are being kept under control, I would say, through the court system. In the failing economy, in the loss of good factory jobs, the dismantling of the working class, of unions in this country that's been happening progressively over the last 30 years. The courts have stepped in to manage and control that population of people who are now jobless, unemployed, marginally employed in the service industry, and the courts is now taking aim at those folks. Well, we've demonstrated this time and time again through simply looking at their own statistics that they provide for us. So if you look at juveniles in the juvenile courts, they're overwhelmingly African American. In just about every sector, you'll find African Americans represent 60 to 80%, maybe even in some cases 90% of the population of defendants. So if you look at the juvenile courts, if you look at traffic stops, are overwhelmingly African American. In Champaign, for the Champaign police, also among who are believed to be a better department in the Urbana police. The numbers are even worse than Champaign. If you look at other things, I did a story on SWAT raids a few years ago, and I studied over 50 SWAT raids. The households that were raided were 90% African American. They were 90% for drug cases. They were 90% based on informant information. So if you look at the population in the jail, we found that they're well over half, around 60% African American. Blacks represent about 12% of the population in the county, about 15% in Champaign, but they're overwhelmingly represented in the courts. We've followed the process from, the point at which people are stopped, the point at which they are convicted and sent to prison. And we find profiling at every stage along the way, from what goes on the streets, from the initial traffic stop. In Illinois here, we collect traffic data. It's sent to the state. Every local department sends the traffic stop data onto the state. They crunch the numbers and provide them back to the local departments. And it's shown, since they started that study in 04, 05, it's shown repeatedly a constant trend, and even an upward trend towards racial profiling. We've tracked this over since 2004, when she was elected, 2005 when she took office. We've tracked this, and it's been pretty obvious and consistent. It's important to understand some history for Julia Reitz and how she came into office. I got here in town in the summer of '04. And there were a couple black guys, activists in town, Patrick Thompson and Martell Miller, who were videotaping police officers. In Illinois, we have something called the eavesdropping law, where you can videotape, but you cannot audio record this eavesdropping law was dug up, dusted off, and they used it to charge Patrick and Martell to effectively shut down their videotaping of the police. This was a charge that was filed by Pilen, John Pilen, the then state's attorney, and this created a good deal of stir in the newspapers. Patrick and Martell started showing their video in town at the local library, at the local art movie theater, and it created a lot of headlines. And so this really blew up in the face for John Pilen and was the reason for his downfall. This became kind of symbolic of the way that Pilen would overcharge individuals. And so Julia Reese ran her campaign in 2004 and courted many members of CU Citizens for Peace and Justice, our group that I work with. I work as a journalist, but I work in tandem with local activist groups to help them better tell their stories. And CU Citizens for Peace and Justice, which was formed late 2003, 2004, we immediately went to defend Patrick and Martell against these eavesdropping charges. Julia stepped up as some kind of ally, sympathetic to the plight of African Americans in the court system, and lambasting John Pilen for overcharging. And this is how she rode into office. She was overwhelmingly voted in late 2004 and took office early 2005. So she subsequently, the charges had been eventually dropped on Martell. She dropped the charges on Patrick. We then went through an ordeal of 3 trials in Patrick's case. So we really cut our teeth and saw how the courts work with Patrick's case, and then we continued to follow what other folks were facing in the courts. So Julia rode into office telling us that things were going to change, that people weren't going to be overcharged, that they weren't just going to use charges to hold over people and flex until they can get them to cop a plea. And we found that time and time again, looking at other cases, that the same old tactics were being used. So routinely, people will be stacked with charges. The charges are held against them until they cop some plea, and the quality of plea they can get depends on how good of attorney they can get. If you have a public defender, you're not going to get a very good deal. If you got a private attorney who's in with the local cronies, you're going to get a much sweeter deal. If you have a university, if you're a student and you have a university attorney, you're going to get a good deal. But for most folks, and I think the cases are like 90% of folks who go through the courts here have public defenders. You're not going to get a very good deal from the state's attorney. Well, across the country, crime rates have been consistently going down. It's just been an ongoing trend. And there's been no visible rise or fall in violent crime in Champaign County. And I don't think there's any correlation between the operations in the courts and crime in the community. I would look at more things like poverty, unemployment as the root causes of crime rather than how strong-armed the state's attorney can be.